At UMass Boston, our students work closely with our faculty and communities. They learn through practice in our history-rich city.
Our students gain skills vital to documenting, preserving, and interpreting the past.
UMass Boston's commitment to community-engaged practice is built into our curriculum, teaching, and scholarship.
UMass Boston has a mission, we're an urban university. We have a mission of giving back to the public.
What I've experienced also at UMass Boston, the professors and the advisors are helping you out, making sure that you're prepared for your next step.
Hello and welcome everyone to our session today. Before we begin, we would like to extend a sincere thanks to NEMA for sponsoring and letting us run this session today called Decolonizing Museums. As a way of introduction, my name is Starr. I'm a citizen of Kirigan-Zibi, Anishinaabeg First Nation. I'm a curator of education here at the Abbey Museum, where I lead our department in our decolonizing work as it relates to public programming, exhibits, and interpretation, and all the various forms that takes on. I came to this work as a former social studies classroom educator dedicated to social justice work. And in graduate school, I did focus my thesis work on decolonizing education for Native classrooms. So I've spent a great deal of time in my career really honing in on skills and methodology as it pertains to decolonization, both in education and of course now in museums.
And my name is Angela Raup. I'm the Manager of Education and Outreach at the Abbey Museum. I have nearly 10 years of experience working in museums and cultural heritage sites with previous roles at the National Museum of Crime and Punishment, the Museum, and the United States Capitol. My experience in decolonizing work is really different from Starr's in that I came from an environment that was so prescriptive in its interpretive models that it discouraged engaging with difficult history to the point where complicated narratives were sanitized and minimized. And to move into a work environment that is committed to truth-telling and reducing harm has been really invaluable to my development as a museum professional and as a person. And I'm very much looking forward to sharing our work with you.
Yes, and before we move any further along today, we do want to acknowledge the land from which we are broadcasting today by reading our museum's land acknowledgement. We are in the homeland of the Wabanaki, the people of the dawn. We extend our respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous peoples and ancestors whose rich histories and vibrant communities include the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, and all of the Native communities who have lived here for thousands of generations in what is now known today as Maine, New England, and the Canadian Maritimes. We make this acknowledgement aware of the continual violations of water, territorial rights, and sacred sites in the Wabanaki homeland. The Abbey is honored to collaborate with the Wabanaki as they share their stories. And though our presentation today isn't on land acknowledgements, I do wish to quickly recognize that land acknowledgements are an example of an outward-facing decolonizing measure. And we love to see people do the work of creating their own land acknowledgements and really grappling with major issues around being an institution, which is part of a settler colonial agenda. And of course, decolonizing methodologies only work when we think in terms beyond just the visible. We have to what we've come to discover in our work is that this work must move beyond exhibits. It must move beyond land acknowledgements. This is institutional work that impacts every level of the museum.
This is meant to be an introductory presentation that will define decolonization at its most basic level. This may be the first time that you've encountered the idea of decolonizing, and for others, this may be a refresher, but throughout our presentation, we'll be going over basic principles and methodologies of decolonization with a special focus on the work that's happening at the Abbey Museum. I'd like to note that while the Abbey is a museum that focuses on Indigenous content, all museums are able to and should conduct decolonizing work. In the upcoming slides, Starr will be unpacking the legacy of museums as colonial entities, but for now, we can see the importance of decolonizing work just within these definitions. On the left, we have a quote from Susan Miller of the Seminole Nation, who defines decolonization as a process designed to shed and recover from the ill effects of colonization. Settler colonialism is an ongoing system of power that perpetuates genocide and repression of Indigenous peoples and cultures. When we talk about colonization, we're always talking about a violent act. We live and operate in a world that prioritizes colonial worldview as the dominant narrative. This means that the violence is ongoing. On the right, we have a quote from Amy Lonetree, Ho-Chunk scholar and author of Decolonizing Museums, who reminds us that museums can be very painful sites for Native peoples, as they are intimately tied to the colonization process. Let's take a moment to really consider what that quote is saying. Museums cause people pain, not just because of their subject matter, but because they're directly connected to settler colonialism. Museums as institutions are engines for the colonial project. In our upcoming slides, we'll discuss how this plays out based on the ways museums occupy land, house, display, and care for objects, conceptualize and gatekeep knowledge, and operate their internal structures. I also want to note that decolonizing ties directly into diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion work. And while anti-racist work is not always decolonization, they do overlap. You cannot engage in decolonizing methodologies without simultaneously doing anti-racist work. Colonialism is driven by racism and white supremacy, in that it assumes that European values, morals, and customs and lifeways are superior, correct, and the default. To truly do decolonizing work, you must be prepared to challenge these notions. Here we have an example of the definition that has been the Abbey's working definition for a pretty long period of time. We've used it both internally and externally to communicate about our decolonizing work. And it states that decolonization means, at a minimum, sharing authority for the documentation and interpretation of Native culture. And while that is very important and it is instrumental to the work that we currently are doing and have been doing, we've actually begun to push beyond this definition and are really taking it a step further. And what this is indicative of is that decolonizing is an ongoing process. It's a framework that we're operating within rather than an endpoint that we're working towards. If there's one thing that I really want to stress throughout this presentation, it's that this work is complex and it's nonlinear. There's no prescriptive way to do decolonizing work, and it will always look different depending on the unique situations present in your organizations. Museums will never be fully decolonized, but they can always be decolonizing. In the next slide, we'll look at how the Abbey structures its decolonizing work, and this is one example of how an institution might develop guiding principles that influence their decolonizing process. Amy Lonetree, who I previously mentioned, is the author of Decolonizing Museums, and our decolonizing framework is heavily rooted in her work. She identifies 3 key areas that museums can focus on, which are: 1, be in the business of truth-telling. History is complex, ugly, and painful, but when we offer a sanitized versions of the truth, it ceases to be truthful. Part of the healing process requires acknowledging difficult history, as well as narratives of resistance and resiliency. The second point is privileging Indigenous perspective and voice. The Abbey Museum is a museum of Wabanaki history, culture, and art. Wabanaki people should be at the forefront of this work, whether it's in exhibit development and interpretation or strategic planning for the museum's future. This also means questioning best practice and abandoning organizational structures that perpetuate harm. And finally, the third point is collaboration with tribal communities in all facets of our museum work. This ties into privileging Indigenous voice, but it also considers the museum as a whole. Wabanaki people are involved with the museum's work at all levels of operation, from hiring to governance to policymaking to exhibit development to strategic planning. Amy reminds us that within an Indigenous decolonizing paradigm, museums can be a site of service to communities. That's ultimately what we're looking to do. We're transforming the Abbey into a site of service rather than a site of harm.
And I'm gonna take it on from here, and I really want to dig into some of the history of museums in this country and really thinking about how museums are intimately tied to the colonial agenda. The history of museum representation of Native peoples begins with the development of anthropology as an academic field. While there are museums that exist in earlier histories, modern day representation stems from 19th and early 20th century, a time when anthropologists were making their careers off of systematically collecting American Indian material culture. This was also a time when Indians were thought to be quote unquote vanishing from the landscape. And in a very real sense, academia and anthropologists were creating an understanding of Native people not informed by Indigenous perspectives, but by white colonizing perspectives. Big collecting museums of the time were the Smithsonian, which opened in 1846, the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard, 1866, New York's American Museum of Natural History in 1869, and Chicago's Field Museum of Natural History in 1893. These museums were aggressive collectors. For example, the Smithsonian's collection grew from 550 items in 1860 to more than 13,000 in 1873. So within a 13-year span, you really get a sense of the exponential growth that's happening within these collecting institutions and really start to make the connections of what's happening at the same time, or both within museums and outside of museums. And during this time, we also see museums, particularly natural history museums, creating systems of classifications. So classifications for understanding. Examples include the Hall of the American Indian. We also see the placement of Native American displays near extinct megafauna of the Ice Age, often coloring the stories about Indigenous peoples of this continent being of the past and only being in the past. Simultaneously, during the rise of anthropology, we have detrimental Indian policy in this country, which sought to destroy the sovereign rights of tribes through the Dawes Act, the creation of boarding schools for forced assimilation, the outlawing of specific Indigenous ceremonies and religious traditions, attempts to physically relocate tribes, and the creation of the reservation system. Anthropologists and collectors were entering communities when they were at their most vulnerable, often taking advantage of the situation to extract as much as they physically could put into storage. They sought to collect what they thought of as the authentic from a people that they saw as vanishing and on the brink of extinction. As museums, we must understand that the connection between federal Indian policy and our spaces, we must start making those connections. And if we wish to really shift toward decolonizing methodologies and really start thinking about reparative justice, we really need to start thinking about the connections between our spaces and federal Indian policy in the past. I can't move much further into the presentation without really talking about and recognizing the gravest violations that museums have participated, the taking and storing of our ancestors. As a Native person myself, I don't necessarily enjoy talking about this history or sharing my feelings about it in public, but I do think it is a necessary thing to participate in. And I really need any audience to understand how deeply rooted this harm is within museum practice today. Amy Lonetree writes in her book that modern anthropology and archaeology and museum practice was founded in great part by violating human rights through the excavation of graves for study without the consent and subsequent storage of remains in collections throughout this country. So at the same time that Native objects were being collected, so too were human remains, especially during the early 19th century when scholars began using human remains to explain physical and cultural differences between peoples. The collecting of crania was popular as scholars attempted to relate intelligence, personality, and character to skull and brain size. This type of study was used to validate theories of white supremacy and the study of eugenics, which really took off in the late 19th century and throughout World War II. And so in a very real sense, we see that the taking of our ancestors is tied to the scientific basis for racist structures in this country and the legitimization of the colonization of our lands. And many museums and universities still hold our ancestors in their collections. And by the time the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act passed in 1990, it was estimated that museums, federal agencies, and private collectors held somewhere between 300,000 and 2.5 million Native American bodies and untold millions of cultural objects. To this day, it's estimated that around 500,000 Native American individuals are still held in US museums, and an equal number are held in collections in Europe. And I can't underplay how incredibly harmful it is, how incredibly harmful these practices have been, and how they still continue to harm Indigenous peoples today. When you consider that even after death, we are not safe, that we could be violated once put to rest. We are not able to complete our full life cycle when we are disturbed from our resting places, and knowing that my ancestors are still being held hostage by so many museums and universities and even private citizens is extremely damaging. And I often say, if we can't see eye to eye on the sanctity of my ancestors who need to be returned, then decolonizing efforts really can't push any further than where they're at right now. And that if you can't see the humanity of my ancestors, how could you ever possibly see mine? Because my humanity is intimately tied to my ancestors' humanity. And though there isn't a blueprint for how to decolonize a museum, I often urge museums coming to me for advice to first look at their collections and compliance with NAGPRA. How has your museum fulfilled its duty to the law? Are there ways for you to build beyond NAGPRA and trust with Native nations? This exercise in repatriation is a vital first step for many, and it builds more trust and starts that reparative process that needs to take place in collecting institutions. So when do we start to see critical conversations around Native representations in museums? The way I personally see it is this huge movement that took place in the 1970s, the American Indian movement, and decolonizing efforts within museums. I see the spark really happening around this time. Dramatic shifts were taking place during this movement, which had huge impacts for Native communities and laid the groundwork for what leaders are doing today. As a result of the American Indian movement, there were several legislative acts, such as the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which sought to protect Indigenous religious practices for the first time in 1978, and the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978, which attempted to restore the harm that had been done as a result of policy, which sought to destroy Native systems of thought and community. And as a result of AIM, there was a push to control our own educational systems, revitalize our Indigenous language, which were historically targeted by the government. There were also several physical occupations of space, like Alcatraz and Wounded Knee, which were responsive and proactive measures toward self-determination among Indigenous peoples. And self-determination remains at the heart of justice work in our communities today and is shifting to our work within museums and other colonial institutions. During the American Indian movement, Native activists started to look at museums as the colonizing forces that they've always been, calling into questions about how objects ended up in museum collections and the control of historical narratives, which were harmful towards Native peoples. I also wish to recognize the work of Indigenous artists who have and quite honestly continue to challenge museum display of Native peoples, cultures, and art. Despite the work of the American Indian movement, museums have been incredibly slow at considering their colonial legacies and the harm that they have caused. Native performance artists like performance artists like James Luna were able to contribute to the conversation around the politics of display. And in 1987, Luna placed himself on display for museum audiences. You'll see that on the slide, on this slide in particular. As he laid in a large case, he had items from his material culture, including a pack of cigarettes, his divorce papers, and his baseball cap. He created labels to explain various scars on his bodies. And this provocative performance piece was held at the San Diego Museum of Man. It's now known as the Museum of Us. But this museum has a really complicated history of displaying the human remains of Luna's ancestors and called into question the politics of display and how museums control narratives of living communities of people. Considering Luna's work and later pushes for change in the museum field, I am struck by the idea of narrative control. At its inception, the American Museum has always controlled the historical narratives of Indigenous peoples. What museum decolonization offers is a way for Indigenous people to control our own narratives on our own terms. Yet, we need and still need Indigenous artists who can push our understanding of what it means to be in these spaces. Native artists today are still pushing audiences and museum professionals to consider the socio-political implications of how museums operate. Some of you might recall in 2018, several artists, including Nicholas Galinan, withdrew their art from the Whitney Museum's biennial show over objections to a board member's tie to tear gas. This was the same tear gas used against Indigenous peoples on the front lines of environmental protests at the Dakota Access Pipeline. And it was also used in Ferguson, Missouri, following the killing of Michael Brown. And in this particular instance, we really see Black Indigenous artists really coming together to hold up a mirror, right, to the institution, to really make us all aware of what's happening behind the scenes and for us to be accountable for what's happening behind the scenes. And I see a very real thread of Native artists being agents of change and holding up that mirror to colonial institutions, and they are part of this movement towards decolonization.
When you hear about the work that's happening at the Abbey Museum today, it's usually centered around our downtown location in Bar Harbor, which opened in 2001. But the organization has a long history. It originally opened in 1928 and was one of the earliest structures erected in Acadia National Park. It still stands today. The building is on a historic registry, and it's one of the only historic trailside museums still in existence. The Abbey Museum was founded by and still bears the name of Dr. Robert Abbe, a summer resident of Mount Desert Island. I'd like to read an excerpt from a book called Indians in Eden to introduce you to Dr. Abbe, as well as the complex beginnings of the Abbey Museum. For many decades, residents and summer rusticators in the Mount Desert Island area engaged in recreational Indian artifact hunting in local shell middens, seriously damaging or even completely destroying many of these ancient Indigenous camping sites in the process. Wealthy people placed their findings on fireplace mantles or in display cases. Those of lesser means displayed them on windowsills or sold them to boost the family income. And so it was that one day in 1922, longtime Bar Harbor rusticator Dr. Robert Abbe took a walk down Cottage Street, saw a window display of a dozen prehistoric tools, and decided to buy the collection for study. Over the next few years, the acclaimed New York surgeon and medical pioneer bought collections and committed himself to protecting and displaying such artifacts to ensure public awareness of the region's original inhabitants and to prod contemplation about life as it was long before the onset of industrialization. Dr. Abbe received considerable help from his friends George Dorr and Charles Eliot, the founding fathers of Acadia National Park, who envisioned an artifact museum as a complement to the park's offerings. In a remarkably short time, Abbey's dream was realized in a lovely trailside museum situated at Sturdivant Spring. The museum opened in the summer of 1928. Its dedicatory ceremony also served as a memorial for Dr. Abbe, who died in March of that year. Dr. Abbe's absence on opening day was conspicuous, but it appears people in the crowd failed to notice that he was not the only missing person invested in the artifacts on display. Wabanakis, whose ancestors had made and used the items in the museum's collection, were not part of this inaugural event. Their absence, coupled with the museum's original full name, the Lafayette National Park Museum of Stone Age Antiquities, underscores the common mainstream assumption that Indians in Maine were part of the past, not the present. Even Dr. Abbe, it seems, bought into the idea of the vanishing Indian. These are the ideas that our organization was founded on. Dr. Abbe would have regularly interacted with Wabanaki people who maintained a presence in downtown Bar Harbor, selling handmade goods to tourists. In Dr. Abbe's worldview, the artifacts in his collection were not Wabanaki in origin, but evidence of a long vanished race of people. Abbe saw it as his responsibility to preserve these artifacts for future generations. So we have a museum founded on the idea that it's an outsider's responsibility to care for, house, display, and interpret material culture, while simultaneously delegitimizing the fact that Wabanaki people have been the caretakers of the Dawnland since time immemorial. It's worth noting that this idea of interrupted presence is not just inaccurate, it's harmful. Myths about the longevity of Wabanaki presence in the homeland have prevented NAGPRA repatriation requests from being completed, and Wabanaki ancestors remain in museum collections due in part to the ideas perpetuated by our museum founder and other like-minded academics. This is the legacy that we must reconcile as we engage in our decolonizing work. As we move forward, I'd like to encourage you to think critically about your own organizations. Colonial systems are deeply embedded into our social structures and our operations. What ways are they present at your sites? I have a few examples here. Consider your collections. Think about the objects that you hold. This is really about finding the humanity in your collection. Are there objects of cultural significance? How are they cared for? How are they displayed? How are they interpreted? Rather than considering just the item, consider the person behind it. At the Abbey, this looks like being NAGPRA compliant, incorporating culturally appropriate protocols and procedures in caring for and housing our artifacts, using traditional knowledge labels in our database software, and having Wabanaki community members guide our acquisitions process to determine what new items we're bringing into the collection. You also want to consider the history of your founders and your funders. Consider your organization's legacy. How was it founded? How was the land acquired? And how is it funded? I've just given an example of our history and how it's complicated, and we need to take that into account. And at the Abbey, being transparent about our organization's colonial legacies is very important to this work, as we discussed in that previous slide. You also want to consider the land you occupy. All American museums exist on occupied native land. So ask yourself if you know whose homeland your organization is built on. Have you taken steps to engage with local Indigenous communities? This is why we open our public programs with a land acknowledgement. It centers and contextualizes our conversation and asks participants to consider the relationship between land and Native communities. It's also a tangible commitment to engaging in decolonizing work and a way of holding ourselves accountable to Wabanaki communities. At the Abbey, acknowledging the land looks like developing those land acknowledgements in partnership with the Wabanaki nations and creating pathways for greening our organization and combating climate change. You also want to consider the narratives that are being told at your site and what stories you choose to share versus those that you choose to hide. When you're developing exhibit content, are there narratives that you're shying away from? Have you ever used phrases like, our stakeholders won't like it, or that's not what our audience is looking for, to avoid sharing difficult histories? Avoiding the truth for the comfort of some museum guests is creating harmful spaces for others. At the Abbey, acknowledging these difficult histories looks like sharing difficult histories, framing content around Wabanaki lived experience, and it also looks like hiring Indigenous staff and community curators to develop exhibits. Try to think about how each of these topics relates back to Amy Lonetree's decolonizing model. Addressing colonial legacies requires truth-telling, first-person perspectives, and direct collaboration in order to be successful. Digging in a little further to the work that's currently ongoing at the Abbey, decolonizing work is happening at all levels of the Abbey Museum, and it's observable externally and internally. I manage the front line of the museum, and I'm directly involved in how visitors experience and engage with a decolonizing museum space. All museum areas that the public engage with operate within our decolonizing framework. That includes the exhibit space, interpretation, our shop, our educational programming, community outreach, and events and markets. When we think about and talk about decolonizing, the conversation often stops at exhibits. It's relatively easy to contextualize how truth-telling, first-person narratives and collaboration exist within an exhibit gallery, but what does that look like in other museum spaces? One area that I really like to highlight is the Abbey Museum gift shop, and I think it's a really interesting example of how we apply our framework interdepartmentally. The gift shop is housed under the education department in the Abbey Museum's organization chart, which we think is a pretty unique thing. We recognize that the shop is a place where visitors learn and absorb content. And we also have the situation where you can enter the Abbey Museum shop without actually visiting the museum itself. So the shop may be the only place that visitors are engaging with our content. This unique nesting of the shop under the education department allows us to create procedures that support our mission, like prioritizing wholesale relationships with Native owned and operated businesses, and only offering books that are written by Native authors. These standards allow us to create retail space where we're supporting Native artists and businesses while deconstructing stereotypes about Indigenous art, style, and culture. I also want to share with you some of the ongoing work that's happening at the Abbey, and this is a new interpretive model that we are working with. One of the most recent areas to undergo an update is our interpretive framework. We're in the process of developing and testing a new interpretive model that centers on disruption, resistance, and resiliency. We've included this because it's an example of ongoing work that speaks to decolonizing as a process rather than a product. The more we engage with this model, the more it will change. Freeman Tilden, in his Principles of Interpretation, states that interpretation should aim to present a whole rather than a part. By rooting our interpretive work in disruption, resistance, and resiliency, we share complicated narratives that present a whole rather than a part. Disruptions include settler colonialism, historical acts of violence, forced acculturation, federal Indian policy, privatization of land, etc. Part of our decolonizing framework is to tell the full measure of history, including those difficult, messy, and hard truths around colonial violence, genocide, and racism. So in our interpretive work at the Abbey, we have to name these disruptions before we then delve into how Wabanaki people resisted and adapted to them. Resistance is examples of Wabanaki countermeasures to colonial encroachments, such as protest, traditions going underground despite immense pressure to acculturate, physical resistance, and defense. Talking about resistance reminds the public that Indigenous people are not passive victims. Instead, it demonstrates Wabanaki agency and continuity. And finally, we have resiliency, which is the stories of continuity, survival, recovery, and adaptation. You'll want to look for stories of resiliency as they connect to disruptions and resistance. Resiliency is demonstrated through stories of continuity, survival, recovery, and adaptation. You want to ask yourself, what are Wabanaki people doing to adapt to denied land access? How are Wabanaki people recovering and revitalizing their relationship to land that they've been cut off from for generations? These sort of questions will lead to examples of resiliency. And an example of what this might look like at the Abbey would be if we were to examine the rise of Wabanaki basketry as a fine art. The disruption would be settler colonialism, reducing access to traditional hunting and fishing grounds, which would force participation in a cash economy. The resistance would be Wabanaki basket makers becoming independent business people, selling handmade goods in order to provide for their families. This allows them to participate in that cash economy without selling their labor to factories or farms. And finally, we have the resiliency aspect, whereby which today Wabanaki basket makers are held in high regard and their work is sold for thousands of dollars as fine art pieces. The basket making tradition continues thanks to intergenerational investment in the art form, apprenticeships, and cultural revival programs. Why does this interpretive model matter? So often the story of the Indigenous experience stops at the disruption point. If we only teach narratives of loss, pain, and diminishment, we reiterate the idea that Native people were passive victims moving towards an inevitable demise. In reality, Native people resisted and persevered through the colonial process, and that resistance is ongoing. Telling these full, complex narratives is an important step in recontextualizing history and accurately representing Native people in museums.
We also want to talk a little bit more in depth about institutional work. So those things that you don't necessarily see on the front line, but are critical to decolonizing work within museums. And these are some examples of areas within museums that we've identified that need to be addressed in our continuing decolonizing work at the Abbey. And I'm sure that there are so many other areas that each of us could identify both within our museums and within other museums. I'm going to quickly highlight some of these and then give you a really in-depth example in the next slide. But we are looking at policy revision. How can we institutionalize change with decolonization and anti-racism in mind? How are we creating spaces that are inclusive by creating policy that supports staff? And we want to make sure that decolonizing methodologies live beyond just the people that are on staff right now, that it really has a longevity and that it continues to grow here at the Abbey Museum. We're also looking at hiring, and we need to ask important questions about how traditional hiring practices have kept Black, Indigenous, and other people of color out of the running for director level positions, and how we can actively make hiring more equitable. We're also looking, of course, at acquisitions, which is a big issue within museums, but how can we move beyond NAGPRA to work in good faith with tribal nations in the spirit of the law rather than just within the confounds of the law? And of course, reparative justice, in which we are really seeking measures to repair in some way the harm done by museums traditionally, and coming up with new ways to work with Wabanaki nations that really work towards a more healing model of operations behind the scenes. I do want to delve into I have the governance on that list, but that's going to be my big example where we really talk about that right now. And if there are any questions about governance, I'd be happy to answer them. Sometimes it's hard to explain it all, but then also really delve into it. But we currently have two, for lack of better words, major apparatuses of governance and decision making at the Abbey. We have a Native Council comprised of 2 representatives who are appointed by tribal government from each of the Wabanaki nations in the state of Maine. So there are 10 seats in total on that governing board. And in the past, they've directed a lot of interpretive work and work more in the educational realm and exhibits realm. And at this time, though, Native Council is really undertaking work with the Board of Trustees to continue decolonization as it pertains to governance. And that brings me to the other governing body, which is a traditional board of trustees, which has had some pretty major changes within the last 4 to 5 years. Early in our institutional commitment to decolonization, we had a focus on board education and a lot of work to recruit more Wabanaki citizens to sit on the board of trustees. And currently we are at a majority Wabanaki board of trustees. And of course we have our Native Council, which is all Wabanaki as well, appointed by tribal government. And this has dramatically shifted the conversations around governance at the Abbey. And I would say even within the last year and a half, the conversations have just really started beginning to flourish. Most recent changes, and when I say recent, I mean really recent. This just happened about a month, maybe a month and a half ago. But our Native Council stated that they would like to self-select 2 members of Native Council who would be full board trustees who sit on the Board of Trustees to officially represent and share their input from Native Council. The Board of Trustees also now currently has a co-leadership model that they've instituted, meaning that one leader, so instead of just having a traditional president of the board or leader of the board, it's a shared responsibility. But one leader is from Native Council, and the other is from the Board of Trustees, Wabanaki or non-Wabanaki from the Board of Trustees. There's also been greater movement towards this trends I've been seeing on the board, a shift away from Robert's Rules of Order and towards consensus-based decision-making. The board has tasked our governance committee to look at institutionalizing consensus-based making and really making that a priority in the next I would probably say the next year, they're probably going to really institutionalize that. There's also been an interesting trend toward working gratitude into each board meeting that I've noticed. And I'm really excited to see where this continues to shift. When I look at this kind of pattern that's developing, I see it as an indigenizing practice that's really taking place within the board. And I don't know exactly where it's going, but I am excited to see where it ends up within the Board of Trustees. And what excites me most about work being done at the board level is that they are trying out new structures with the understanding that we can change again if we need to. And it's really refreshing because I often get people who want to know the right answer right away to how to do this work the best, right? How can we decolonize? What is that blueprint? What is my first step? What is my second step? But it's really refreshing for the Board of Trustees that are just testing things out, and they have an understanding that the first thing that they try might not be the model that we end up with, and that they're willing to put in that work, they're willing to talk through it, and they're willing to try new systems of governance. So I think what they're exercising is what we should all be exercising, is this idea that we can try out new things, see what works, and then be really critical and reflective of those processes that we develop.
As we move towards wrapping up, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge how the public has responded to our decolonizing efforts. That's always a big question for people. You know, what does this mean for us as an organization? What would it look like if we were to put this into place? And when we talk about decolonizing with other organizations, we're often met with apprehension. People say things like, oh, I could never do that at my organization. The board wouldn't go for it, or our visitors just wouldn't get it, or even we'd lose donors. And we understand that these challenges and changes might feel insurmountable. We assure you that it's worth the effort, and we're not asking you to make a big overnight switch. The examples that you've just heard from us are the result of nearly a decade of work in building relationships, in shifting attitudes, and committing to doing better. Even small changes make a big difference in creating museums where everyone feels welcome, safe, and represented. And we truly believe that this work is not only worthwhile, it's essential. We're ultimately creating learning environments where both visitors and museum staff feel supported, comfortable, and appropriately represented. Museums are trying to be more inclusive, but you can't be inclusive without shifting power structures and questioning best practice. Living into our decolonizing framework is beneficial for our organization and for our museum guests. Our decolonizing efforts have strengthened old relationships and fostered new ones. We've also found that museum goers are ready to engage with complicated narratives and that they expect museums to be socially conscious community hubs. We'd encourage each of you to take what you've learned throughout this presentation and apply it to your own practices. And if you need help in getting started, know that you've got friends at the Abbey Museum who are ready to lend a helping hand.
And of course, we have our information up on the screen right now. Please reach out to us if you have more questions or would like to be pointed in the direction of more resources to help you as you consider decolonizing methodologies. We are going to be taking questions, and we encourage you to use that Q&A box. That's where we're looking for all the questions. And so until the end, that's what we're going to be doing.
I'm going to go ahead and turn the camera back on, and we do have a wonderful selection of questions to go through. And so I think to kick things off, we're going to start with the one that has the highest number of upvotes with 11. It's an overwhelmingly white organization who wants to decolonize. How do we approach potential Indigenous partners without seeming tokenizing or white saviory?
Oh, that's a good question, because you don't want to fall into that trap of being or practicing white saviorism. I would always highly encourage people to go through tribal government officials, so like through the right channels. So if you are working on a project, seeking out tribal historic preservations officers whose work is really dedicated to this type of collaborative process. I don't know if you have another thing you want to add, Angela, to that in particular.
I'll just add that rather than approaching the conversation from a point of view of what can we get in order to include your voice within our institution, really looking at it as an opportunity to form a relationship that's rooted in servitude. And so reaching out to these organizations and saying, we recognize that this is something that's important for our organization. What do you need? Are there projects and initiatives that we could support you with? And start really building those relationships before asking, what can you do for us?
Absolutely. I think that's really critical. I'm really glad that you brought that up, because that extractive relationship that museums and have with Native communities does continue today oftentimes, and we do see that with asking for help on projects. But to really think of it as an opportunity to build relationships is important, and to be able to walk the other line, right? To also be of service to Native communities is really important within a decolonizing framework.
I would also add that compensating Indigenous people for their time is crucial. We know that you're operating within small budgets, but if you're going to do this work, really set aside a stipend so that you can appropriately compensate people for their time rather than expecting that they'll do the work for free. Or looking at some sort of an exchange where it is, we're not able to compensate directly, but we can help volunteer at this community event, or we can offer some sort of an exchange rather than just, we really need somebody to vet this or to be a second set of eyes for the work that we're doing. All right, we've got one that says, Can you talk more about how an organization could do decolonizing work throughout the organization if the board or senior leaders aren't open to the work? Which is a tough one.
Yeah, this we get this one a lot. And of course, it's amazing when you can get your leadership on board with you. But it's something that I've encountered a lot as an educator as well in the classroom, where you don't necessarily have all of the support from the top down, right? And but if we can think of ourselves as workers within our own spheres of influence, I think it really radically changes our perspective. So really hone in on what spheres of influence you have and think about what you can do in a decolonizing framework for your spheres of influence. So if you do have control over some educational programs, then embed what you can embed in it, right? If you want to, what I would do as an educator usually is like, you know, I have to teach this content, but along what I'm teaching, but simultaneously, I'm also asking students to question everything that this content is teaching them, right? Like, so it's really thinking about creative ways in which you can embed this on your own and thinking about ways that you can reach out to other partners and allies as well. And if you are somebody in a room where you have significant influence, you know, using your voice to amplify Indigenous perspectives and new ways of thinking about decolonizing museums is really important. So really utilize those spheres of influence that you do have.
We have another question, and that is, how does an organization go about tackling a one-time event of colonization, like an expedition or to somewhere or a battle?
Can you reread that?
Sure. How does an organization go about tackling a one-time event of colonization, like an expedition to somewhere or a battle?
Okay.
So thinking like organization specific, we're associated with this incident.
Oh, okay. I get what you mean. I think no matter what, even if it is a one-time event in history that maybe your organization is tied to, or that you're perhaps have an exhibit about, you have to connect it to a larger framework of settler colonialism. It's going to be really important to this work. And if we think about it within a framework of how did this event, or how is this event continue, or intimately tied to the continual taking of land and the extraction of resources, I think you can tell really compelling stories. Without knowing more specifics on what that person meant, it's kind of hard to tell, but you can get there. And I think it is important to connect it to the larger framework of settler colonialism.
Can you offer some concrete first steps and/or resources for starting a land acknowledgement process?
I actually have like a to-go or a list of resources, because I get a lot of people, especially after presentations, contacting me. And so if you would like to contact me, I will be happy to share out those resources. There's a lot of conversation on both ends about land acknowledgements and their usefulness and how important they are, and criticisms of them that I think we have to engage in. And I'm really glad, you know, I work with Angela and I work closely with our current director, Chris, and we really are of the understanding that we don't want to write land acknowledgements for anybody, that the process of really researching and engaging in the content around land acknowledgements, around settler colonialism as they pertain to your institution, is really important educational work that you need to do and that your organization needs to do. And so we're big proponents of giving you all the resources that we possibly can so that you can continue your work. And, you know, if you'd like us to look it over after, or you just want to kind of share what you came up with after, or some of the conversations you're having, I think that's amazing. And we really look forward to that. But I always say, and I'm not saying that this person asked us to write one for them, but like we won't write a land acknowledgement for anybody, but we encourage you to engage in that work.
I will share that our land acknowledgement took almost 2 years of collaboration with our Native Council in order to develop. And, you know, when you think about the idea, 2 years to create one statement, it's a process and a commitment. And that's why you see such organizations within our land acknowledgement. It's very conscientious. It speaks to the work that we're doing. And it's also a commitment to where we're going as an organization. We're operating in servitude to Wabanaki nations. And we're also acknowledging the ongoing violations within the Wabanaki homeland. And so really leaning into the creation of a land acknowledgement as a process. And considering that you're almost making a commitment when you're delivering one. And each time that you say those words, you're reaffirming that commitment. This person shared some feelings about their presentation as well as a question, and they asked, that there are an estimated 500,000 Indigenous bodies being held in American museums and another 500,000 in Europe is deeply shocking and upsetting. Is there any organized effort to locate these remains worldwide so that they can be repatriated?
I don't know about efforts on like the world scale. So many of these efforts are really happening tribe by tribe, you know, to the people who are responsible for bringing ancestors back home. And, but I'm not familiar with like one particular. I will say that there have been instances where a particular institution, and I'm still thinking like within the United States, like where multiple tribes are having issues with one institution, where they really are trying to like come together to have concerted efforts, right? And these are like lessons that we learned during the American Indian movement of like, if we pool our resources, if we work together, because we have this common issue, right? Getting our ancestors out of, you know, one institution or another institution, then I definitely have seen examples of that. And so they're always really encouraging to see those examples, even if they don't always pan out the way we want them to.
If you're interested in that too, there's going to be the NAGPRA at 30 session, and that's a great opportunity to deeper into these conversations and learn more about the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, and maybe answer some of those lingering questions that you have around that challenging history. We do have one more, and it's, can you show your last slide again? I think they probably mean the one right before Q&A, but if not, just make a note and we'll back up to the slide that you're looking for.
Maybe it was this one. Is it time-stamped, the question?
338.
I'm going to guess it was this one.
I think so.
Okay. And of course, this presentation is being saved on this platform. So if you do have any questions or need to go back, you should be able to still access it for up to 3 months afterwards, I believe. So.
All right, I think that's the last of our questions, and we are just about out of time. So.
Thank you, everybody, for attending today. Again, we do encourage you to reach out to us if you have any more questions or would like to talk more. And we look forward to all the other presentations that are going to happen. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.